We have seen this movie before. Governments, or those who hope to form the government, on the hunt for money. They look at their assets and conclude it's time to privatize booze sales. Choice, convenience, competition, and a possible spring election. What should Ontario's next steps be in the sale of beer, wine, spirits, or liquor? Should we, as the Conservatives have suggested, sell the LCBO? Weighing in with their thoughts, Steve Del Duca. He's the Liberal MPP for the riding of Vaughan and the Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Finance. Peter Sherman, Progressive Conservative MPP for Thornhill and the Opposition Finance Critic. Michael Prue, New Democrat member for Beaches East York and the NDP's Finance Critic. And Martin Redcon, Queen's Park political columnist with the Toronto Star. And it's good to have you three back. And we welcome you for the first time here to these parts. You just won your by-election, what, a couple of months ago, I guess?
About 110 days ago, give or take.
About 110 days ago, not that you're counting. Okay, well, let's go to you first here then, Stephen. On New Year's Day, on New Year's Eve day, the government, I guess, announced a few changes on the way they wanted to sell spirits in the province. And why don't you remind us of what those changes are?
Well, it was a really exciting announcement. I know taking place over the holidays itself. A lot of chatter from family and friends about the announcement that my colleague Dwight Duncan made, trying to expand the access and choice that consumers have, people who shop at the LCBO, by opening up a couple of new different kind of options for people who are looking to purchase those products. So we have the destination boutiques that are going to be opening up to help showcase Ontario's VQA wines in existing LCBO stores. And we also have the LCBO Express outlets that are going to be opened up in locations to be determined as part of grocery stores that exist in various parts of Ontario. Over the next 12 to 18 months, the LCBO is going to be taking a look at where best to place these particular options. It's a very exciting opportunity for consumers to have some increased convenience and some access. And
what prompted this move?
Well, there's been ongoing analysis and conversations taking place. The LCBO is reviewing exactly how it meets the demand that consumers have for wanting additional access and convenience when it comes to purchasing their products, while at the same time balancing out the social responsibility aspect of all of this, which is really, really important. And it was a response to making sure that we keep moving down that path towards balancing social responsibility and making sure that the LCBO continues to derive that $1.63 billion dividend for the people of Ontario that was delivered last year, to keep growing and moving in that direction.
In early December, Peter Sherman, your party had something to say about this. What were your ideas?
We talked about taking a complete, renewed look at an 85-year-old system of how alcohol in general is marketed in the province of Ontario, which means spirits, wine, and beer. But the focal point was the idea of selling all or part of the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. This is not the Ontario of 1927, and that's how far back the LCBO goes. I listened to my colleague Stephen Del Duca talk about the motivations of the finance minister on New Year's Eve day, announcing a scant 10 stores sometime between 12 and 18 months from now. I'm talking about supermarkets. If you can imagine 10 supermarkets in the entire province of Ontario where they're going to experiment with little boutiques where you go to a separate cache to buy some limited number of bottles. The bottom line on this is not enough, and this was announced for only one reason. It was because we went out there and, in what Mr. Duncan called a boneheaded move, talked about divesting the LCBO. The only thing boneheaded is coming out 2 weeks later and saying we're going to do this because of what my colleague says is social responsibility. Social responsibility? The social responsibility shown by the current government is to allow its LCBO to publish 500,000 copies of a glossy magazine every year to tell us how to pour blue curacao in a glass and have a summer cocktail, when they're the only guys who sell blue curacao.
Okay, that's the government's position, the opposition's position. How about the third party? Where is the NDP coming from on this?
Well, I mean, the NDP's heard all of this before. We've heard it from Liberals. We've heard it from Conservatives. We've seen it in elections. We've seen, them stand up and think that this is a popular thing they're going to do. We're going to, privatize the sales and put it in the corner grocery stores. We've seen it before. It never happens. The reason it never happens is the LCBO makes the government of Ontario $1.6 billion a year in profit. That's what they make. And if you divest it, then you have somebody else make the profit. And for those who want to do that, Where are they going to get the $1.6 billion? That's the question we ask.
That is patently untrue.
It is
Michael,
not patently untrue.
Sorry, which part? Which part?
The fact that you're going to lose $1.6 billion that is supposedly profit by divesting the LCBO. Look at Alberta. Alberta netted $300 million when it owned the liquor stores. It nets $800 million now. There were 900 SKUs, that's different kinds of spirits, wine and beer, on the shelves at the time they owned it. There are something like 16,000 now. How can you talk about losing money? Monopolies make money because they're monopolies, but monopolies are not good business. Governments shouldn't be in business. Governments should provide good governance, which the Liberal government of Dalton McGuinty has not done.
Yeah, but with respect,
The
Peter,
choice for most Albertans going way down.
Hang on a sec. You've had two. I got to let him have a second one here. Is there not a way, in your view, to either privatize or loosen up on the liquor sales while at the same time realizing the same profits into the Treasury that we have today?
I have no problem loosening up. I do have the problem with the privatization. I mean, there is a case, and a good case, to be made for the small boutique wineries and for the small craft breweries that do not have enough product to actually get their product into the LCBO or into local corner markets. I mean, there needs to be a place for them to sell it. Our grape growers need the help, our small boutique wineries, and certainly our wineries, fruit wineries. They have a very few markets, and so I would like to help them. And I think that there is a case to be made, and perhaps something akin to what the Liberals are doing is a good idea. But I do think that it's important that it be maintained with the people of Ontario because we are gaining the profits.
Okay, stand down for a second to our political friends at the table because we need to hear from Martin on this. Martin, I suggested off the top we have seen this movie before. This is either the third or fourth time that a party has come forward offering, quite revolutionary change to the way liquor and booze sales are done in the province. Why does this happen all the time?
Well, it's politically popular to tap into that kind of discontent. People are always going to be unhappy with the LCBO. That's a perennial. I'll make one. Look, it happened in 1985 when David Peterson made the promise. 1995, the Tory leader Mike Harris promised to look at it and led people to believe it would happen. And now Mr. Hudak is doing it again. I'll make one prediction. The LCBO will not be privatized when Mr. Sherman, when Mr. Sherman and Mr. Hudak win power. What they will do is tackle the beer store, which you may want to talk about later.
We'll come to that later.
But the LCBO, here's the thing about the LCBO. If, to quote a former Tory premier, or to perhaps misquote him, if it ain't broke, don't dismantle it. Okay, don't privatize it. You can fix it, however, and I think that's what people will find.
Well, what do you mean fix it? What's broken about it?
There's a lot that needs to be improved at the LCBO, and Mr. Sherman always calls me a Tory apologist, so I'm not going to let him cast
a liberal apologist.
A liberal apologist. We're both from Quebec, so we're actually the Quebec side today, the Quebec-born beer and corner store side. But I'm not going to be the LCBO apologist. I'm just going to say you don't throw the LCBO out with the bathwater. Mr. Sherman mentioned the glossy ads that are in the Saturday papers. It's actually 750,000, and it's good for my paper's revenue, but they're not really very useful, and I have to say they are.
Sorry,
so that's
they spend $750,000.
No, it's 750,000 copies are distributed of these glossy, heavy paper recipes and things like that. That no graphic designer.
Paid for by advertising in the magazine itself.
Totally. So they're actually paid for by the suppliers who are hit up by the LCBO to bankroll this. Then you have air miles that are given to consumers in a monopoly environment. That doesn't make a lot of sense. That's what Air Canada does to fight off Delta Airlines or whatever. You don't do that when you're a monopoly. And the third thing, as the Auditor General has pointed out, is they pay too much for their supplies. They overpay. They ask their suppliers if they can overpay for the wholesale price just to keep the retail price high for social reasons. So there's lots that can be fixed at the LCBO, but there are many reasons not to tamper with it.
Let's again go in order of preference here, as they say. Sure. Is there a way to change the way the LCBO does business while at the same time realize that $1.6 billion of annual revenues that the Treasury needs?
I think it's an ongoing evolutionary process. That's why we see the announcement that we made just a couple of weeks ago with respect to those two new options. The LCBO is a world-class organization, and it's constantly working with government and stakeholders and people out there in the broader community to make sure that it's refining how it does business. But to Martin's point, it makes no sense whatsoever to sell something that's going to cost taxpayers that revenue that comes in. That's revenue that we take and we invest in crucial areas like healthcare, education, and in infrastructure investments.
You couldn't sell the LCBO and still realize the same amount of revenue?
Well, it doesn't make sense. Like, in the past, we've seen other governments of a conservative stripe in particular sell off other really crucial public assets. Highway 407 is a good example. And that's a situation, an example that we continue to have a bit of a hangover effect with respect to.
Give us an example here, Peter Sherman, of how you could sell the LCBO to private interests and still realize $1.6 billion to the Treasury every year.
You could decide, for example, that you're going to retain the wholesale division of the LCBO and you're going to franchise stores on the retail level. Look, here's the thing that Stephen and Dwight Duncan and the Liberal government won't admit. They have a study that says that if they went ahead with plans along these lines, they could net at least $200 million more, probably more than $200 million. But you have a study. You have a study, and we have a copy of it.
Who did it?
I can't tell you who did it off the top of my head, but I have a copy of the study, and I can supply that information.
This is
the bottom line,
that they believe you're talking about.
It is from 05. Yeah. The bottom line on this is that governments. You know what? You had your turn. Why don't you be quiet and let me finish?
Okay.
The bottom line is that governments do not derive revenues by owning businesses. They derive revenues by taxing businesses and by generating economic activity and by creating economic activity that creates jobs. People pay taxes, stores pay taxes, that kind of thing. The mining industry is not owned by the government, for example. Alcohol distribution is not the exclusive province of the LCBO. It's done by thousands and thousands of food service workers, for example.
But in our wisdom over the years, governments have decided that there's something different about selling liquor as opposed to drilling for diamonds.
What government, Steve? There are governments all over the place who have divested themselves of this. We've used Alberta as an example. We could talk about British Columbia. We could talk about Iowa. We could talk about a lot of states. We could talk about, more recently, the state of West Virginia. And you know what? None of those governments have experienced any revenue dilution as a result of divesting their owned operations.
Michael Prewster.
Well, I'm just listening to all of this. I mean, we saw what happened when the Conservatives tried to divest Ontario Hydro. We saw what happened with that very failed experiment and electricity rates going up and everything turned into a mess. Is that what the people of Ontario want with their Liquor Control Board? I don't think so. I think people are generally very happy. Oh yes, they're you're going to get the odd crank who's going to say that this doesn't work or they'd rather go down to the corner store. But when you go into a store in Ontario, I'm telling you, I think that the stores are modern, they're convenient, they have knowledgeable staff, and I really believe that in terms of the way it's run, it stops drunks and kids and people from buying the booze. No, I think it is part of the point. It is part of the point that the people of Ontario want and accept. I'm waiting to get into the beer store argument because I think it might be slightly different. But I think the LCBO does a great job. The world's largest importer of spirits and wine, and knowledgeable, and if they could just get their pricing right at the top end, so that we didn't have to pay more than what the wholesale price. That's the only thing that I would really want to see change.
MRC.
Can I try to be helpful on a couple of points here? First of all, I think the $200 million that Mr. Sherman is talking about, I might be wrong here, but off the top of my head, I believe that was the suggestion that that's what the government would lose, not gain, by privatizing.
It's gain.
But it's not. What I will say to help everybody here is it's not $1.6 billion that's at stake. We're not going to lose $1.6 billion by privatizing. Let's agree tonight, without our notes in front of us, that we're talking about plus or minus $200 million. Okay, so it's not the end of the world. However, it is an enormous amount of cash flow. And I would argue that as a monopoly that distributes at a big scale with huge economies of scale, when you break up that monopoly, you will lose some of that profit, some of those efficiencies, and some of what you have. Let's not make the mistake of comparing Ontario to Alberta. Alberta's liquor distribution system was, by all accounts, a mess before it was privatized. People were clamoring for change, as they perhaps are on the beer store, which we'll talk about later. I have to say, my anecdotal sense, my personal view of the LCBO is that it is a pleasure to buy at most LCBOs. The staff are so helpful, they sometimes drive you crazy if you're a connoisseur, which I'm not. My wife is. Mr. Prue is. What I would say is that there is not a consensus for getting rid of the LCBO among Ontarians. That's why the Tories have recognized that they're not going to do this in the next, if and when they win power.
Well, that's what you say. But the quick follow-up here: the Conservatives, in their wisdom at the moment, have decided. Yes, Peter, I'll get to you in a second. They have decided, in their wisdom at the moment, that there are some businesses the government ought not to be in. Lottery and gaming might be one of them. Booze sales might be another one. If that's their, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but if that is their ideological position, that government ought not to be in the booze business, shouldn't we look at selling?
I think you can make an ideological argument, absolutely, and you'll never get everyone to agree. That's why I think this is an issue that cries out for a practical, pragmatic, dollars and cents, and common sense assessment.
Well, let me give you the pragmatic reason and the driving force behind this idea. And this is not 1995 or 1980, whatever. This is 2013. And what we're facing is two things. We have a very vastly spread out population of adult Ontarians who have a right under law to drink. And they should have access in the nearest possible proximity, and they should also have access to choice. That was a driving force. The second and really important one is, to all intents and purposes, the Liberal government has bankrupted Ontario. To all intents and purposes, that's where we are. We're pushing on $300 billion debt, and it's going higher. We need to liberate and free up capital. There are tens of billions in capital tied up in a privately run monopoly that's held privately by the government. If we can divest that and unlock that capital, we can go and address things like gridlock. We can pay down debt, which they don't seem to have any proclivity to do.
But let me ask you about you've mentioned two of the 3 points that I often hear about this. Let me talk about the third, which is, I don't know if you're ignoring, but you didn't in that answer refer to the social welfare, the social responsibility angle on this, which is that the LCBO make sure that people who are under 19 don't buy booze. And the question is, can mom and pop private corner store operators do as good a job?
Two things on that. The corner store operators are policed in terms of the sale of tobacco, very heavily policed on sale of tobacco, which is at a lower age, mind you, from what liquor would be sold at. And they do very well. And in mystery shopper tests, the Ontario Convenience Store Association has demonstrated that they're actually more efficient than the LCBO. That's the A. B, there are a heck of a lot more people out there selling booze to citizens of all ages in bars and restaurants and at sporting events than there are in LCBO stores. Do they have any more or any less social responsibility?
Stephen.
So, in terms of the access question, Peter wants to sort of have it both ways. There are hundreds and hundreds of options, outlets out there across this province, from traditional LCBO stores to agency stores to the bars and restaurants that he's talking about. Access, generally speaking, is not something that is a significant issue, regardless of whether you live in an urban center like Toronto or, for the most part, live in an area that's a little bit more remote. This doesn't make sense economically. To Martin's point, it's why no government of any particular color or stripe has moved in this direction at any point. It doesn't make sense socially, because notwithstanding what Peter's talking about, the LCBO staff do a world-class job. This, to me, is nothing but a bit of a distraction on the part of the Conservatives. They tried it a little bit on the same subject in the run-up to the last general election.
Well, in fairness, you guys, before you got there, the Liberals mused about selling it as well.
We did. We reviewed it like they did when Mr. Hudak was in the last cabinet. They've reviewed it. We've reviewed it. We've all ended up in the same place, economically speaking. It seems to me that when there's talk of an election on the horizon in Ontario, both in 2011 and now here we are again, some people talking about the possibility, Tim Hudak and the Ontario PCs always want to dangle this option in the window, I think, to distract people away from the rest of the destructive policies that they're putting on the table. It's not going to happen, to Martin's point, because frankly, Ontario residents like the system the way it is, with that evolutionary process continuing. That's why we made the announcement just a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, stand by here. Let us read a graphic here called A Question of Competition. Jerry Nichols, who's a pretty prominent Conservative voice in these parts, wrote this in your newspaper back in December. I want to read a small excerpt now and then we'll discuss. Privatizing the LCBO and opening it up to free market competition should be, he writes, a no-brainer. Common sense suggests, therefore, that if private retailers were given the opportunity to sell liquor, consumers would greatly benefit. This was certainly the case in Alberta, which privatized liquor retailing nearly 20 years ago. Indeed, according to a study published by the economic think tank, the Fraser Institute, Alberta's privatization resulted in significantly more liquor stores, better product selection, more revenue for the government, and after the stores started to multiply, lower prices. Michael Prue, your view on that?
Well, first of all, I don't buy that. I look at the source, first of all, who wrote it, and I'm not a great big fan of the Fraser Institute, nor are most people. But I just want to ask, you go to small town Ontario, you pay exactly the same price for your liquor, your wine, your beer in the LCBO as you pay in Toronto. And if they don't have it, they can get it for you, usually within a few days, at the same price you pay in Ontario. be careful what people wish for, especially if you don't live in a big city like Toronto or Ottawa, where you have that kind of selection in the LCBO. Because if you live in small town Ontario, you are going to see that dry right up. There isn't enough market to have big stores, but there is. But there is.
You already have it.
But the LCBO will deliver the wine, the liquor within a couple of days. I remember once going with Gilles Bisson. We flew into Moosonee. We went into the little tiny liquor store in Moosonee, and you know, they had a selection. The price was exactly the same as Toronto.
Okay,
and he said, if you don't have, I can get it for you in a couple of days.
But I do have to follow up on the point he just made, which is if you go into small town Ontario, the LCBO outlet is in the local supermarket. It's in the same place.
It is now, but if you privatize it the way Peter wants to, if you're a private company, why would you keep it there?
Not true.
If the demand isn't there to the same extent. And would the pricing be uniform? To Michael's point, it probably wouldn't. Bottle of Chardonnay in Toronto costs the exact same bottle, costs the exact same in Moosonee. If this is privatized, there is no guarantee of that.
These are agency stores. They're generally run by families. They're run responsibly. They're the same people that you express fear on the part of the current government for the social responsibility they have. They've demonstrated great social responsibility. What's to prevent them from having a franchise store going down the road? Look, I understand why you're here. You're protecting your flank. The fact of the matter is your government has made a mess of Ontario, and we're looking at ways to get us out of it.
It's just another distraction on the part of the PCs.
This is a demonstration on how ideology can poison the debate here, or clarity. I agree with Mr. Sherman that there's no reason convenience store owners can't check IDs. They do for tobacco today. Where I disagree with him is where he suggests that selling off the family silver is a good deal. That's not. The LCBO is a productive investment that reaps enormous dividends. It's a risky proposition to privatize it. The Fraser Institute, as Mr. Prue suggests, is a basically right-wing think tank. Another left-wing think tank, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, found the opposite outcome. That prices went up, that selection went down, that the selection improved.
I got something
but
on that.
But the general anecdotal impressions of Alberta liquor stores is that they're kind of seedy, or they're very variable. In Ontario, for better or for worse, it's the Holiday Inn. There are no surprises. And there are some very upscale stores that actually work in the markets that they're situated in to attract buyers.
Okay,
So
I got the other side of the story here. Control room, let's put this graphic up. Today, Alberta earns nearly 25% less revenue per litre of alcohol sold than prior to privatization. In fact, Albertans would have enjoyed the benefit of an extra $1.3 billion if government revenue from liquor sales had continued to be generated at pre-privatization levels. This revenue loss is largely due to the gradual erosion of Alberta's real inflation-adjusted liquor tax rate. So lower taxes mean cheaper booze, right? Wrong. Recent research indicates that Albertans pay among the highest liquor prices in the West, prices higher than those on offer in the publicly owned stores of BC and Saskatchewan. Peter Sherman, can you speak to that? That's from the Parkland Institute, which has also studied this.
That's what they say, and the Fraser Institute says something else. I have a graphic here, which I can't put up because your control room doesn't have it, but it's Alberta liquor sales, and it shows a very significant slope upward, and the slope tells the tale because it's real money reported by the public accounts of the Alberta government. And what it says is in 1994, when they started to go private, they were netting 300 and change million. At this point, they're at 800 million. Does that sound like a diminution to you? It sounds fine to me.
Here's the deal. Alberta's system was broken. It needed to be thrown out.
So the LCBO, not a good compromise, not a good comparison.
Yeah, and the LCBO is not broken.
But it's not about being broken, Martin. What it's about is what I said. It's about liberating capital that is owned by the taxpayers of Ontario that is desperately needed to get that debt down or to build infrastructure, things that we are desperate for because there's no money in the kitty. And that's the driving force here.
Yeah, but on an annual basis, if you're going to lose the revenue that we've been talking
about,
you're not going to lose it. You are clearly going to lose it.
There is no jurisdiction that has ever done this that's lost it.
Peter, if that was the case, then why didn't your government, when you were last in power, the PCs, when Tim Hudak was a minister, why didn't you privatize it then?
Maybe because we put 1 million new jobs in the private sector, as opposed to losing every job in the forget
the other distraction. Just why didn't you actually privatize it then? Mr. Hudak was the minister with partial responsibility.
Stephen, when you consider different things, your government has considered it as well. Maybe the time has come.
We know the answer. It's another distraction on the part of the Ontario PCs.
Let me bring the union angle into this if I can. LCBO employees are unionized. They make a good wage for the job that they do. There are those, Michael Prue, go to you first on this. There are those who suggest that if you privatize the LCBO, you could pay those people half as much to do the same job, and that money then would go into provincial coffers as opposed to going into the pockets of the employees.
How would it go into provincial coffers? If it was privatized and somebody paid them $10 an hour to stock the shelves and to know about wine, probably you wouldn't get very good employees to begin with. But those that you got, the profit would go to the person who owned it. It wouldn't go to the government. How would the government save any money there?
Well, again, the theory is that if these store owners are making more money, presumably they're paying more taxes to the Treasury.
Well, no, I beg to differ. I'm not sure that they would be paying more taxes to the Treasury. I think what is happening now is that we have this wonderful thing called the LCBO that gives us a lot of money. And when you start to tinker with that, you had better be prepared for what the second think tank had to say about this, is that it's actually going to decline. If it declines, where are the Conservatives going to get the money from? Where is it going to come from? Is it going to be because these new owners are going to pay more taxes? Well, then say it.
The money comes from a basic markup, and I can give you a perfect example. A bottle of American bourbon comes in typically landed about $5.50, if you can believe it. That's what you buy it for, if you're the LCBO. The first thing that happens is you mark it up about 149%. That markup wouldn't go away. That's the price to which it goes to retail. And then there's a markup beyond that. That differential markup would be in the hands of the private operators. The $1.6 billion that keeps being referred to as the crown jewels remains there from that 149%. And that's before you even get to things like the 8% portion of the HST that the province collects. So we're going to lose nothing here.
I don't want to lose the union piece of this, though. Is part of the rationale for privatizing the LCBO to take these jobs out of the hands of unionized employees and put them in the hands of non-unionized employees?
Not at all. I think what you've got, first of all, there's nothing to prevent the unions from plying their trade in the private sector. That's number one. They can go out and they can unionize those employees. There's also a lot of expertise amongst the employees of the LCBO, and it'll be in demand if you multiply the number of liquor outlets in the province. Those people will be wanted and they will be well paid. They're not $10 an hour convenience store employees.
Martin?
I salute Mr. Sherman's candor for the first part. I think he's right that there is that people have a misapprehension that privatization will lead to dramatically lower prices. Let's be candid with your viewers. Prices will barely change. It will change at the margins because the markups will remain, and that's where most of the profit, the dividend, comes from. As for the unionized workforce, I think you're right. I think that is where the savings would be captured. It's hard to dispute that.
Okay. Well, you have the floor, and with how much time left? A little under 10 minutes to go? 7 minutes to go. Shall we talk about the beer store, which has been one of your favorite hobby horses?
That has to come out somewhere. Right?
You have been writing the nastiest columns about what they call the beer store now, what we used to call Brewers Retail back in the day. What's the problem?
Someone had to say it. Look, I think here's one suggestion I would give Mr. Sherman and Mr. Hudak. They held a photo op for their announcement about privatizing the LCBO and the beer store outside of an LCBO outlet. They should have held it outside of a beer store because that's where the public discontent is at its highest. It also would have helped to remove some of the confusion because a lot of people were thinking that the Tories would privatize the beer store. It's already privately held.
It's owned by the private brewers.
It's owned by a monopoly of 3 of the biggest foreign-owned brewers. And people don't realize that. They're used to the idea of the beer store looking and feeling like an old Stalinist government-run institution from the 1950s or 40s.
But presumably this is for convenience sake, right? It's easier to distribute booze if you can do it all to the stores that they already own.
That was the thinking in 1927 or 8 after Prohibition. And the LCBO got the heavy stuff, and the breweries across the province got the less intoxicating stuff. And they were wholesalers at that point. In the 1940s, they bought out the retailers and became vertically integrated. Then the beer industry itself rationalized, and you had 3 big breweries, and then they were globalized and became 3 foreign-owned breweries. That's crazy. Why are 3 foreign-owned breweries dictating the terms of sale in this province amongst the beer stores? We should allow for competition. We should allow for so-called, people say corner stores. Again, misunderstanding. In the current day and age, and in Quebec, it's not just corner stores. It was like that when Mr. Sherman and I were little kids. It's now Costco. It's now the supermarket.
So anywhere, basically.
And so a big box stores that can do things efficiently. Corner stores will be for convenience. The big box stores, the supermarkets that are pretty good at retailing in this day and age, far different from 1950 or 60, can deliver service, I think, more effectively.
Is that your position?
And I salute you, Martin Redcon, for recognizing
He's
a
such
reality.
a Tory apologist, isn't he?
Look, I'll give you some numbers. The beer stores in Ontario number around 1,500. They are, as Martin points out, privately operated, so we have no particular say there as a government in waiting, other than we can free people up to sell beer somewhere else. If you go to Quebec, which I did recently, there are about 10 times that number of outlets, 16,000, and it is in the food stores everywhere. And you know what? The social responsibility piece, I took a look at the figures on deaths in traffic, alcohol related per 100,000 population. They're about the same in Quebec as they are in the province of Ontario. What is wrong with the responsibility of people in Ontario that they can't go to a supermarket or a corner store and buy beer? And what is wrong with putting in the hands of those corner stores the sale of beer? If we can do it rurally, we can do it in an urban way. So distribution and choice and treating people like adults is fair.
Where are the Liberals on this?
Well, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is that what we've experienced over the last little while is that consumers, like myself, like my wife, when we want beer, we tend to buy our beer at the LCBO. And consumers are actually voting with their feet on this. In my constituency, in Vaughan, for the most part, the beer stores and the LCBOs are actually in the same plazas. And there are a lot of people that are opting to choose buying their beer at the LCBO, perhaps because the customer experience is better for them, but because the beer store is a privately run operation, it'll be up to them, as any other privately operation, to determine whether they can do better with that customer experience and compete. They are losing business to the LCBO and beer stores. I think they would admit if asked. And also the announcement that we made just a couple of days ago around the additional options for buying. The express outlets that we're going to be adding to some supermarkets and some other venues over the next 12 to 18 months will include the sale of beer, which will help with some of the access.
You would not open it as much as Martin Redcon would suggest.
Well, I think it's an ongoing, again, evolutionary process. The LCBO is going to take a look at these two new options over the next 12 to 18 months and beyond, see how it plays out. This is a bit of a pilot run that we're doing, and if it seems that it's working well, I'm sure we'll continue to evolve that way.
Michael Prue, what's your position?
First of all, the pilot run's fine by me, but I think it's way too slow. And I think if we want to get to this, we have to understand that the beer store is run by 3 companies, and that they put their beer out in the front where you can see it most easily. If you go into most of the beer stores, they're pretty grubby. I mean, they're not very nice places to shop. You know, and you've got a beer bottle, perhaps an empty one, or just a label on, and you're trying to figure out, and you can't read it. I mean, when you go to buy wine, you can read the year it's from, the region it's from, the types of grapes that are in it. You can read all that. You can't do that with a beer bottle. You don't know what kind of percent alcohol. You don't know anything. And so I think it needs to change. And if they're not willing to change, then we have to find some other way. And I especially think this is true of craft breweries, because that's the real exciting place to my mind, where the beer, you know, the big 3 can continue to sell their stuff in the beer store if they want, but I think the craft breweries have to be, you know, given the opportunity to show Ontarians what really good beer is all about.
I've got 30 seconds left. I'm going to give it to you. I want you to look into your crystal ball and tell us whether you think all of these issues we've been talking about today have the potential to be something that could actually change votes whenever the next election takes place.
Change votes, that's a good one. I don't know if it's a lot of things that people think are vote determining issues, like abortion and other things, aren't. So I don't know that people would vote for Mr. Hudak for beer, but I think it's a good idea on beer. Let's see if the other parties respond to that. Let me just say that everyone who complains about the beer store talks about the LCBO being an alternative. You can't buy a 2-4 at the LCBO. And so for people who like to buy their craft and exotic beers, that's great. It's not good enough. People don't have to be forced to go to the beer store to get a good deal.
And as is the case on almost all things, the Toronto Star gets the last word. Thank you all, gentlemen, for coming to our studio today and joining us for this discussion. We want to thank Stephen Del Duca, the new member for Vaughan. We want to thank Peter Sherman, the MPP for Thornhill. We want to thank Michael Prue from Beaches East York, and Martin Redcon, the Queen's Park columnist of the Toronto Star. Gentlemen, a pleasure having you all here.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.